start Namokar Mantra and then
Yeah.
outside. I think you go open for a while.
Yeah, we can do that.
There's a clip here.
Okay.
When the light of does it, the one of the scenes you don't see. But they will.
AC चालू करवाने আছে I have to requested AC
Hello? Hello? Camera, hear me? Is that on? Not on?
It's on.
It's on. Okay.
Your place for it.
Yeah, I'll put it here.
I knew.
Let me just find my parents.
Oh, you talked to
Yeah.
Oh, is this starting now?
Yeah, in like a couple. 2 minutes.
Yeah, after he was coming over here.
Your mom is gone already.
Oh, shit. Okay. Oh, that's fine.
Feedback. So you got a range there.
It's like an electric fence.
Right. That's a feedback.
Now, does Jitnabin want to do the Namokar Mantra?
Yeah.
No, you do it then. I don't want to do it.
But it's the only thing I'll get to the YouTube.
Huh?
It's not we'll join in.
Join in what? The Namokar Mantra?
Yeah.
You start these cycle.
When we get started, we start now.
I'm just going to wait 1 more minute and see if my parents get here. You know, she was sitting right here. I don't know where she went.
No, she went upstairs to tell them now that we are going to start.
Oh, yeah.
Upstairs to tell them that we're starting the lecture.
Uh-huh.
If anybody wants to go, because they might not know, right?
Sheila, we told her she went to yeah, go. Okay, at least they're not just starting the lecture.
So that's why she went upstairs.
Okay.
ये तो आती है वो नीचे बैठे हैं
Yeah. Huh?
9:30.
Oh, 9:30?
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to wait?
Then we done this with them, then we do aarti or whatever.
Okay, that won't be too late? Won't be too late.
9:30?
ના ના એનાઉન્સ તો કરાયું ને
કરાયું?
મેં જ સાંભળ્યું ને ખબર નથી પડી એટલો અવાજ છે કાંઈ સંભળાતું નથી
એટલે ગિરીશ એટલે વિરેન્દ્રભાઈ કીધું કે લેક્ચર ચાલુ થાય છે એવું બધું
શું કીધું કઈ કીધું ખરા પણ શું કીધું એ મને નથી ખબર કારણ કે આઈ કુડ નોટ લિસન ટુ મને સમજાતું નથી Yeah, we can start.
Yeah? Okay.
9:30 ક્યાંથી
9:30 શરૂ કરીએ I think is announced.
Okay, so
પણ મને સમજાણું નહીં શું કીધું.
Either way is fine with me. Huh?
give them few more minutes.
All right, yeah, we can wait. It's
They're
okay.
trickling in.
Yeah.
ઘણા બધા બેઠા છે they want to, you know, listen to this, but પછી I think they're trying to wrap it up upstairs, but it's
You take another 15 minutes.
What is your total estimated time?
1 hour. Yeah.
has to be
It's going to be 1 hour.
whatever to get the whatever.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Fans are in the back.
I'd like to.
Because it goes up to 10:30, people are coming together.
Yeah, no problem. I'll wait maybe like 3 more minutes and then we'll start.
9:20.
Yeah.
Let's go. They'll join and they can watch the rest of it.
Yeah. No, I think it's fine. Yeah, it's okay with me.
Because we also have the YouTube audience.
Oh, okay.
Then you can start over again.
Yeah, that's okay. We can maybe start with Namokar Mantra, and then I'll just kind of give an introduction. Yantaram, Namo Siddharam, Namo Vajayaram, Namo Vajayaram, Namo Loisavasahunam, Eso Panchanamokaro, Savyapavapanasano, Mangalanam Cha Savyasim, Padamam Havai Mangalam. All right, I think we'll start. Welcome everyone and thank you for coming. My name is Dicky Shah for those of you who don't know me. This is my second year doing a presentation for Paryushan. Last year I talked about the history of Jainism, and this year I'm going to talk about the scriptures. A little bit about the content, but more about how they evolved over time. We're going to talk at first about the history of Jainism just briefly, kind of give an overview to help get some context for the rest of the lecture. And then we'll talk about the origin and the transformation of the different scriptures and how they differ from the Svetambara tradition and the Digambara tradition. And then at the end, we'll just hit on a couple of specific scriptures that I think you'll be quite familiar with. By the way, my wife has heard this presentation a bunch of times, and she says that it's not very boring. Okay? It's just a regular amount of boring. So it's good news for you. All right. So let's start with an overview of the history of the religion. Now, when we talk about the history of Jainism, it's one of the oldest religions in the world. And we are in a bit of a disadvantage because there isn't a lot of really old evidence. The further back in history we go, the less and less there is to learn from. Less evidence to support your ideas. So what we have to do is we have to kind of fuse together a little bit of evidence, a little bit of faith-based history, and we kind of weave it together with some speculation so that we can come up with a plausible story for the early history of our religion. 3300 BCE. This is the beginning of the Bronze Age in India. It corresponds with the early Harappan period of the Indus Valley civilization. It sees the advent of agriculture, science, technology, writing, poetry, architecture, all the things that make up society as we know it today. Well, what does this have to do with Jainism? How is Jainism connected to this? Well, in our traditional beliefs, who do we say brought man civilization? Who do we say taught man to be civilized? Rishabdev Bhagwan, the first Tirthankar. He also went by another name. Anybody know that one? Adinath Bhagwan. Adinath Bhagwan means first world teacher. And he taught 72 sciences, we believe, to mankind and brings them out of the primitive era and into the civilized era. He also had knowledge of the 14 Buddhas, and as we'll talk about later, this is our original scriptural canon. Well, what about the evidence? I mean, it makes sense to put him in this period. I mean, it's logical, right? He brought man into civilization, and this is the beginning of civilization. But is there any archaeological evidence, any historical evidence to support this idea? Well, unfortunately, we don't know much about the Indus Valley civilization. It's a long time ago, right? 5,000 years ago. We don't have a lot of information. But with the little scraps of information that we have, historians have drawn a few conclusions that are quite intriguing, I think. First of all, they believe, based on the number of bull iconography that they find in the excavations, that the symbol of the bull was very important. Well, what's the symbol of Rishabdev Bhagwan? This is the bull. There doesn't appear to be any emphasis on military strength. It sounds like could support this idea of ahimsa. And there was really no concentration of wealth, which sounds a little bit like aparigra. Obviously, this is a lot of speculation, but it's still kind of interesting, I think. Well, here's a bull seal from one of the excavations. So 2,000 years go by, and the teachings of Rishabdev Bhagwan, the Purvas, our scriptures, are passed on from disciple to disciple. And there are periods of time when the knowledge fades, and another Tirthankar comes and revives the scriptures. And this brings us to the next period in Indian history. This is the age of the Vedas, the Vedic period. Now, this period sees the rise of Brahmanism. And Brahmanism is a religious movement that is based on the set of Sanskrit scriptures called the Vedas. Now, central to the Brahmanism movement is the idea of a supreme priest caste. Okay, an elite group of priests who were the only ones allowed to read the scriptures, possibly the only ones who were able to read the scriptures. They were the only ones allowed to perform the rituals, including animal sacrifice, that you needed to attain your salvation. So they controlled your destiny, spiritually speaking. You also see the rise of casteism. And this is a concept in which you are born into a certain caste and you are stuck with that lot in life for the remainder of your life. Nothing you do is going to change that. It's predetermined. And they use the doctrine of reincarnation to justify this, because you were born in a low caste because of something you did in a previous life, and that's just your bad karma. Better life, better luck next life. So, as you can imagine, quite predictably, a group of movements, religious movements, rose up in opposition to Brahmanism. And these movements were known as the Shraman movement. Shraman means seeker, one who performs austerities. They said no to the authority of the Vedas. They rejected animal sacrifice, and they rejected this idea that the priest was the only one who had control of your spiritual destiny. Instead, they said that anyone, no matter your caste, can achieve salvation. All you have to do is perform austerities, live an austere life, and follow the right path. And of course, that path would depend on which Shraman movement you happen to follow. Now, one Shraman movement of the time was led by the 23rd Tirthankar, Parshvanath Bhagwan. Does anyone know what that movement was? That's a trick question because the answer is not Jainism. Anyone? What movement, what Shraman was led by Parshvanath Bhagwan? And my wife knows all the answers, so she can't answer. The Nirgranth movement. Nirgranth means unattached ones. And this title set apart the followers of Parshvanath Bhagwan from the other Shraman movements because they were so austere, so strict in their giving up of possessions. They're totally unattached. The term Jainism didn't exclusively belong to us until about the 9th century. Back then, every leader of a Shraman movement was considered to have been victorious over their self, their soul. So they were all Jains, and so all their followers were Jain. But over the years, all the other Shraman movements died out, and only Jainism survived. Parshvanath Bhagwan lived from 877 BCE to about 777 BCE. He also had knowledge of the 14 Purvas and taught that to his disciples. His doctrine was called Chaturya Dharma, or fourfold restraint. Now this is going to start looking familiar. The four restraints were ahimsa, aparigraha, satya, and asteya. Right? Non-violence, non-possessiveness, non-lying, and non-stealing. And his teachings, like everyone else's teachings at the time, were passed on in the oral tradition. The next period in Indian history is called the Majanpad period. Now this is a period of the 16 great kingdoms. Here you see Kuru from Mahabharata. This is Varanasi. This is where Parshvanath Bhagwan preached. This is the kingdom of Magad, one of the most powerful kingdoms. And this is the capital here, Patliputra. Actually, Patliputra will come in, we'll talk about it and its importance later. And right above there is a town called Vaishali. And here in Vaishali, in 599 BCE, is born the 24th Tirthankar, Mahavir Bhagwan. Now, Mahavir Bhagwan's parents are followers of the Parshvanath Bhagwan. So he's already born into this Nirgranth tradition. Okay? And over time, he amasses a following of his own. But his teachings are a little bit different from his predecessors. He adds a fifth restraint, brahmacharya, the restraint of celibacy. His teachings, his doctrine is called Panch Mahavrat. His followers don't wear any clothing, as Parshvanath Bhagwan's did. So how do you reconcile the differences between Mahavir Bhagwan's teachings and Parshvanath Bhagwan's teachings? I mean, they're both Tirthankars. They both have omniscience, right? So their knowledge is the same. So why is their teaching different? Well, we do this with one of the central tenets of our religion, Anekantva, multiplicity of viewpoints. You have to remember that 300 years has passed between Parshvanath Bhagwan and Mahavir Bhagwan. And 300 years means that people are different. Cultures are different. Right? Traditions have changed. 300 years of history has interceded. You cannot teach the same lesson that you taught 300 years ago in the same way now. Right? What you do is you adapt your teachings. You adapt your way of conveying the message. The message is the same, but the way it's taught is different. And that increases its relatability to your audience. And it increases the ability of your audience to understand your message. Now, we historically or traditionally we believe that Sudharma Swami, who was last surviving Ganudhar, last surviving of the chief disciples of Mahavir Bhagwan, took his teachings and composed his doctrine in the form of the 12 angs or limbs. The 12th ang contained the entirety of the 14th Purva from his predecessors. So you can imagine how massive a compilation this must have been. And remember, nothing is written down. This is all being memorized and recited. To give you an idea, does anyone want to guess, or maybe you know, what is believed to be, how many verses were believed to be in the first ang, the original version of the first ang, and in the 11th ang? Any guesses? Wild guess. 1 million. Well, the first ang had 18,000 verses. And all had to be memorized. The 11th ang had over 18 million verses. And all of them had to be memorized and recited and passed on because nothing was written down. And the next major event in Jainism's history happens during our first empire period. All right? First empire in India is, anybody? The Mauryan Empire. It's actually written right up there. All right, so the 16 kingdoms are no more. Now we have one empire that covers most of India. This is a time in Jainism's history where there is the big split between Svetambara sect and Digambara sect. Now around this time, Bhadrabhahu Acharya is the last leader of a unified mendicant order. He's also the last of the Shrutkevalis, the last person who knows, who has perfect knowledge of all the angs and all the purvas. And Shrutkevali because he has gained this knowledge by hearing it and listening and memorizing it, not by omniscience. Well, he takes a group of monks and he leaves Patliputra, which is the capital of the empire and it's the center of Jainism at the time. And he leaves with about maybe 12,000 monks. He migrates, some believed south to Karnataka, some believe onto Nepal. And he's gone. And some believe that he predicted a 12-year famine. And to escape the famine, he left with his monks. Well, in his place, he leaves Stulibhadra, his disciple, his chief disciple, in charge. And Stulibhadra sees the need to revise the scriptural canon. And we'll get into a little bit about why later on. But he convenes a council of acharyas called the Patliputra Council, and he creates this revision, this recension of scriptures. Well, 12 years pass, Bhadrabhahu dies, and his monks return to Patliputra. What do they find? Well, they find a new version of the scriptures that they had no part in creating, and they find that the monks have taken to strange practices like wearing clothing. They have new ideas about women's roles in the religion. Well, they say, forget it. We're rejecting all of this. None of this is valid. And so begins the split between the Svetambaras and the Digambaras. Now the split starts here, but it doesn't really become a very solid split for hundreds of years later. Okay? So what happens to the scriptures after the Patliputra Council? Well, still nothing is written down. Right? Everything is still memorized and passed on, but people's memories are starting to get weaker. People and monks cannot possibly memorize 18 million verses anymore. And so the knowledge fades again. Now eventually, to preserve whatever knowledge is left, through either a series of additional councils or individuals' efforts, the scriptures are finally committed to writing. And at that point in history, they become fairly fixed and copied and propagated. So let's start talking a little bit about the scriptures themselves, the evolution. Now, Everybody recognize what this is? The Quran. This is the Quran. I picked this topic because I grew up in the United States and I grew up in the United Kingdom. And all around me, everyone I saw had a holy book. It's the Quran or the Bible or the Tanakh. And in this book was all the doctrine, the rules, the stories, everything about their religion. In this nice, convenient, single volume. It was a concise, compact reference for them. Very easy to read, very accessible. And I started thinking, well, where's my Bible? Where is Jainism's version of a book, a holy book? And so I started doing research into it. And the first thing I found was that Jainism's idea of scriptures and the Western idea of scriptures is very different, vastly different. First of all, the Western scriptures are considered to be a fixed canon of God's literal message. The authority of His original word is carried in this book. And it's exactly as He relates it to His apostles and His chief prophets. And it remains fairly unchanged, relatively unchanged, for hundreds of years. Different books are added and taken out over time, and there's different translations, but by and large, it's all contained in one book. Jainism is totally different. Okay? The Jain version of the scriptures is not fixed. It's an evolving canon. It includes commentaries and summaries, revisions, translations, and all of this is added to this growing, evolving canon and still considered authoritative and canonical. It's written by many authors over many periods of history. The other thing about the scriptures is that it has a ritualistic power that transcends its literal meaning. Okay? When it's recited in rituals, when it becomes the object of veneration. Okay? We see this in the Namokar Mantra, in the corpus Sutra, especially during Paryushan, and even in the Mudbidri manuscript, which we'll talk about later. Now, regardless of this secondary power or secondary significance of the scriptures, it is very clear, especially early on in Jainism, that they were composed to be understood by everyone, to be universally understood. And no more clearly is this seen than in the language in which they were composed originally. Okay? Does anybody know what is believed to be the original language of Mahavir Bhagwan's teachings? Yeah. Not Pali, but you're right. Ard Magdi. Ard Magdi literally means half Magdi. And it was a Prakrit dialect, and it was the vernacular, the colloquial language of Magad, which is where, if you remember, Mahavir Bhagwan was preaching. It's the language that the common people used, right? It was a language that even uneducated people could understand. Now, Mahavir Bhagwan spoke or composed his scriptures and composed his teachings, as Gurudevs did, in Ard Magdi. Ard Magdi was considered to be a mix of Magdi and some foreign dialects that probably languages and dialects spoken in the border regions of his land, of his region. So it's kind of like Spanglish, right? Well, by speaking in this half language, what he did was he ensured that a maximum number of people, regardless of their background, would understand what he's saying. And in fact, our teachings, our traditional teachings, teach us that as soon as Mahavir Bhagwan spoke, no matter where you were from, you immediately understood what he was saying. Right? Well, this is maybe why. Now, Svetambaras believe that the Prakrit that is currently the language of their current canon is this same Ard Magdi that was what Mahavir Bhagwan used. Now, there's no way of really knowing if that's true or not, because we really don't have any examples of Ard Magdi from way back then. But it's possible, and it's considered a belief. So I wanted to draw your attention to this sharp contrast between the way that Mahavir Bhagwan's teachings were conveyed and the way that the Brahmanism conveyed their teachings. Ardhmadhi is all about inclusivity. It's trying to make the teachings accessible to everyone, right? Contrast that with the elitism of using Sanskrit in the Brahmanical teachings. Okay, Sanskrit, which uneducated people couldn't understand, and that was okay for the priests because they were the only ones who wanted to be able to read them anyway. All right. Anybody recognize this? Yeah, this is the Namokar Mantra. Right? It's written in the Devanagari script, and it's Prakrit, Jain Prakrit. Now, I put this up here because I'll bet that most, if not all of you, when you first learned Namokar Mantra, you did not learn it by reading it like this and then memorizing it. All right? Most of you, most of us, learn Namokar Mantra by hearing it, repeating it, and reciting it over and over again until you get it right. Right? And once you master it, you then pass it on to your kids or the next person. Right? Well, that demonstrates one of the fundamental difficulties we have when we try to construct an early history of our scriptures. And that is that no really old samples of the scriptures exist because they were passed on in an oral tradition. Right? Another reason is that there were no manuscripts. If they were passed on in an oral tradition, why would you have a manuscript? Right? Monks in Jainism are not allowed to have any possessions, okay? Let alone massive volumes of manuscripts that contain all the agams that you're supposed to be memorizing anyway. Now, eventually, it was clear that it had to be written down. The monks just couldn't remember everything. And so, they wrote them down. But they wrote them down on palm leaf, not on vellum or parchment, because that's animal skin, and we're Jains. The palm leaf manuscripts were subjected to the hot and humid climate of India. Not very good for preservation. So, unfortunately, the oldest surviving manuscripts date no earlier than the 11th or 12th century CE. This is 1,500 years, in some cases, after they were originally composed. You compare that with the earliest Buddhist texts, which are 1,000 years young or 1,000 years older, because they were found and kept and preserved in the cold, dry climate of Nepal. So we have to use tradition, a little history again, speculation, indirect evidence, and references, so that we can construct a plausible story for our scriptures, much like we have to use for our history. So, let's talk about the scriptures. Well, in the beginning, there were 14 Purvas. Considered the oldest part of the Jain canon, they were first taught by Rishabdev Bhagwan. They contained, or they were said to contain, all the knowledge in the universe. Now, I said in the beginning, but in reality, our traditional belief is that the 14 Purvas were beginningless. The Tirthankars gained knowledge of the Purvas through omniscience, and they were able to pass on that knowledge to all the disciples. But they didn't compose the Purvas. They were not the authors of the Purvas. To get an idea of how vast work this must have been, there's a saying that the ink powder needed to write the first Purva would cover an entire elephant. The next Purva, the second Purva, would require twice that much. The third would require twice that much. And on and on and on. Right? There's 14 of them. So, as if that wasn't enough scriptural material, along comes Mahavir Bhagwan, and he adds to the Purvas his 12 angs. Now, Mahavir Bhagwan's uttered words, if you're Svetambara, or the holy sound that emanated from him, called Divya Dhvani, if you're Digambara, was interpreted and translated by his Ganadhars into the 12 limbs of his doctrine, the 12 ang. So even right in the very beginning, we have interpretation and translation. It's part of our scriptural tradition. The fourth part of the 12th ang contained the entirety of the 14 Purvas. So you can imagine how huge this work must have been. They were a guide to both laymen and monks on how to live. They contained instructions, stories, biographies, histories, didactics about the universe, the cosmos, the sciences, true nature of things. They contained rules for monks and lay people. Pretty much everything you needed to know to attain salvation, plus a lot more. So far, so good. But a few hundred years pass, and now the scriptures are in total disarray. We talked about the 12-year famine, right, during Bhadrabahu's time. Now, some historians believe that this was not a literal famine. It wasn't a famine of food, but a famine of knowledge. And perhaps it was a metaphor to describe the total chaos of the doctrine at the time, the fragmentation of the scriptural corpus. There were so many varying versions of the angs that were circulating at this time, so many varying and sometimes contradictory commentaries and expositions of the scriptures floating around, that something had to be done. So in the face of this famine, you remember Stulibhadra, left in charge after Bhadrabahu left. He realizes that something has to be done to preserve whatever knowledge we have left. And so he convenes the Pataliputra Council. But there's a problem. He doesn't have all the knowledge. No one in that council did. Why? Who had the knowledge? Who was the last person alive to have complete knowledge of the scriptures? Bhadrabahu. He's not there anymore. He left. So what do? Well, what happens next depends on which sect you follow. We'll talk about the Svetambara version, and then we'll talk about the Digambara version. Svetambaras believe that Bhadrabahu, that Stulibhadra goes to Bhadrabahu to ask him to teach him the Purvas, all of them, so that he could include it in the canon. Bhadrabahu teaches him the Purvas, but he forbids him to include the last 4 Purvas. Now, why he does this, we're not sure, possibly because he thinks that mankind is no longer able to handle all the 14 Purvas. They would be dangerous in their hands. So only 10 Purvas are included in the scriptures that are composed and organized at the Pataliputra Council. So already, just a couple hundred years after Mahavir Bhagwan, our scriptures are incomplete. Well, 7 generations of acharyas later, the rest of the Purvas disappear as well. And eventually, the entire 12th ang is completely lost. So what happens? What do? Well, in the Svetambara tradition, there are a series of additional councils, or vanchans, which literally means recitations, because none of this is being written down yet. So they're reciting what they know, what they remember. And each one happens after a 12-year famine. So again, this idea of a 12-year famine probably meant that another time when the scriptures became chaotic. The next major one was led by Skandil Acharya in 300 CE in Mathura. And then finally in 466 CE, a council led by Devardigani Kshamashaman in Vallabhi, in Gujarat, was convened, and now finally they write the canon down. They write down the scriptures for the first time in Svetambara tradition. Now, we don't have any existing copies, as I said, of that original scripture that was written down or copied, but we do have some, and eventually this is what it probably looked like. This is, I think this dates from, the 15th century, and it's a section of the Corpus Sutra. So pretty well preserved, but of course this is like 1,000 years later. So what was in the Vallabhi canon? Well, it had supposedly 45 texts. Now, the list of the texts, the earliest surviving list dates no earlier than 13th century. So, it's a little bit of speculation to say that that list that we have was the same list that was composed back, hundreds of years earlier. But that's what's generally believed. Now, from this point onwards, the canon or Agam is this 45 text list for Murti Pujak Svetambara Jains. But why are there 45 texts? Right? We said that there were originally 12 ungs and we lost one of them, so how did we go from 11 texts to 45? Well, it turns out that most of these scriptures that were included in this canon were commentaries, secondary scriptures, and they were added over about 1,000 years after Mahavira Bhagavan's time. But they were all incorporated and considered canon, authoritative, even though they weren't the direct teachings of Mahavira Bhagavan. So let's talk about what they were really briefly. It's a little bit tedious, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but what they were, 23 of them are considered the inner corpus, because these are the 11 ungs, right? The 12th one is lost, and they're correlating 12 upangs. And the upangs and the ungs are both believed to have been composed by Mahavira Bhagavan and his Garnadhars. After that, we have all the commentaries that we mentioned. These were written later by other authors, but some of them are also quite old. 6 Ched Sutras, including Kalpa Sutra, which was written by Bhadrabhau, who we know lived around 300 CE. 4 Mul Sutras, 10 Prakranaks, which are sort of like a miscellaneous box of texts, 2 Chulika Sutras. And after this, and Stanakvasi Jains accept the inner corpus, but not all of the later commentaries. So they have 32 texts in their corpus. And later, additional texts were included and considered sort of a secondary canon. And it's in this secondary canon that we find works like the Tattvartha Sutra. All right, let's go over them really briefly here. These are the ungs, all right? And you can see the names here on the left. These are the translations in Sanskrit. So they cover a wide variety of topics, and they're in a wide variety of forms. Acharang talks about the lives of the ascetics, including Mahavira Bhagavan's biography. We have some that talk about heretical doctrines. Some are just compilations of lists relating to doctrine and the other content in the ungs. We have one that explains the doctrine in terms of dialogues and legends, another one that explains it in terms of stories and similes. This one contains the story of Malinath Bhagavan, according to Svetambara, the only female Tirthankar. We have ungs that contain stories about pious laymen, ascetics who achieved moksha, stories about those people who were reborn as gods. Then there's an ung that explains the entire doctrine in a Q&A form. We have another ung that talks about the legends of karmic retribution of both good and evil actions. And then we have the lost ung, the Drishtavad. That's what it's called. And this is all speculative because we don't have it anymore. It's gone. It's lost. But they believe that the first part of it may have given instructions on how to read the second part, which were a series of aphorisms dealing with correct and heretical doctrine. There's another part that talks about other legends and histories. And then the fourth part, which we talked about earlier, was the Purvagat. All right? This is considered the oldest part of the canon, which is now completely lost. The Purvas have a variety of topics: substance, origin and decay, basic truths, the power of substances and gods, different types of expressions and logic, correct and wrong knowledge, true and false speech, quality of the soul. We talk about different types of karma, how to get rid of karma. It also goes into sciences, medicine, music, art. Talks about the cosmos, math, and eventually tells you how you can achieve salvation. So it really does cover everything in the universe. And then at the end you have the Chulikas, which are a series of addenda. So that's the Svetambara version. So what about the Digambara version? Well, the Digambars, it was fairly straightforward. They, like the Svetambars, believed that Bhadrabahu was the last Acharya who had complete knowledge of all the Purvas and all the Angs, but after him, they only had 11 Angs and 10 Purvas, just like Svetambars believed. And after that, a few generations later, the 12th Ang was totally gone, and you only had 11 Angs. And then, this is where they differ from Svetambars. They believe that the rest of the Angs disappeared too. We're finally left with one, and then eventually even that knowledge is lost. So none of the original teachings, none of the original doctrines of the Angs are left, according to Digambars. Now, I thought this part was very interesting. The Digambars believe, or they accept the enumeration of the Angs. So they agree with Svetambars about the titles of the Angs. They just don't agree about the content, because they think the content is gone. So whatever content Svetambars say, they think is not authoritative. And this was really a fascinating example of this. The Digambara version of the Chulikas seems to contain a bunch of magic mantras. You could, if you learned this, do things like stop water, go through water, devour fire. You teleport yourself to distant lands with the help of magic. You perform all sorts of miracles. You could turn yourself into a lion or an elephant or other animals. You could transform plants and metals into other things. You could even fly through space. Very powerful stuff, right? Well, obviously, all this information, all this material is lost. Otherwise, right now, we'd probably have a bunch of people flying through space, turning into elephants and devouring fire. So one version of the Digambar history says that by the 2nd century, as we said, most of the Angs are lost. But around this time, there is an Acharya Dharsen who's living in seclusion in Chandragufa, the moon cave, in this place. This is Mount Girnar in Gujarat. And he realizes that the knowledge of the scriptures is fading fast. And he says, we have to do something to preserve this. So he calls his 2 disciples, Pushpadant and Bhutpali. And he recites to them the few fragments of knowledge of the Angs that he still has, that he still can remember. And what do? They compose from these fragments Shatkandagam. And they finally commit the scripture into written form. Shatkandagam means scripture in 6 parts. And even though it's a mere fragment of the Angs, it's still 6,000 aphorisms written in Prakrit. It's divided into 6 sections, and this is as I said, believed to be the first written scripture in Jainism. A few years later, another Acharya, Gunabhadra, living in a different place in India, who also has some fragmentary knowledge of the original scriptures, composes Kashai Prabhata, or Trees on the Passions. And these works, Kashai Prabhata and Shatkandagam, are said to be very difficult to understand, okay? Very hard to read. So 700 years later, 2 very important commentaries on these works are written. First by Virsen, called Davla, and then by his disciple Jinsen, called Jayadavla. And together now, they are added to the original works. And together, they comprise the Digambara canon, their version of the canon. Okay? So there's Siddhanta. And a total of 120,000 verses. Still, this is just a mere fraction of the angs, but there's still 120,000 verses in it. It's huge. Shatkandagam contain these 6 parts. You can see that most of the information is about karma and bondage, and the last one here is the largest section, 40,000 grunts about how to get rid of your karma, about the bondage. Well, they also have a series of secondary canonical works, and they divide them. They're written, in the next few centuries, and they're divided generally into works that involve the that talk about the universal history, cosmology, the proper behavior for monks and laity, and then this last section, Dravya, which is all the works that talk about Jain philosophy, and in this section, the Digambars also include the Tattvartha Sutra. So they have Tattvartha Sutra in their secondary canon also. So we talked about, I mentioned earlier that the oldest surviving manuscript dates from about the 11th or 12th century. This is the story of that manuscript. Okay? Around 1100 CE, a palm leaf manuscript was written of Shatkandagam and Kashaya Prabhata and the commentaries. And this manuscript was taken and kept in Mudbidri, which is a town in Karnataka. And it was written in Old Kannada, the language. Well, centuries pass, and by the 18th century, these scriptures are no longer able to be read. No one understands the language, so no one can read them. They can't decipher them. And so they're venerated as objects of worship. Well, in the late 19th century, a wealthy merchant by the name of Shanti Prasad Sahu, who is visiting Mudbidri on a pilgrimage, learns of these manuscripts. And he decides that they should be translated. And so he raises money to have this happen. Well, 26 years later, the translation, undertaken by many, many acharyas, is finally complete. 1922. And what happens? The temple authorities refuse to allow it to be published. They don't want it available to the public. And it's not until several years later that in a very un-Jain way, they're stolen from the temple and they're published anyway. And finally, the temple authorities relent, and now these are available for scholars to decipher. All right. Let's talk about the lost Ang. Now, both Svetambars and Digambars accept that this Ang is lost. Why? It's called Drishtavad. Okay? That means disputation of views. So there's been a lot of scholarly interest in answering that question about why is it lost. Well, one thought is that it contained discussions about competing and heretical Shraman movements. Okay? The beliefs of other Shraman movements and how they are wrong. That's what the whole thing was about. Now remember, in Mahavir Bhagwan's time, there were many, many Shraman movements. Okay? Not just what ended up becoming Jainism. So, in order to promote Jainism, or your version, Mahavir Bhagwan's version, there probably had to be some discussion about why the other movements were not acceptable. But over time, those movements all died out. So why do we have to memorize it? Why memorize something that has no relevance? The only thing it might do is start people thinking about these competing views. Well, that would be a little bit counterproductive, right? Other people believe that the material in the 12th Ang was better explained in other commentaries and later texts, and then some people believe that the 12th Ang contained information that wasn't really relevant to you on your path to liberation. And remember that people's memories, monks' memories, were becoming weaker and weaker. And so you could barely remember the other Angs. Let's let this one go. Right? Kind of like studying for a test. All right? You're not going to, if you have a chapter test, you're not going to study the entire year just for that chapter test. And so that's possibly why eventually the 12th Ang was lost and it was never, remembered. Now, as we've seen, not only in Digambara tradition and Svetambara tradition both, the resulting scriptural corpus is massive, right? Hundreds of thousands of verses. It's unmanageable. How are you supposed to read all of it, understand it, learn it? Very difficult for people these days. Maybe at the time of Mahavira Bhagwan, people were better able to comprehend this, but those days are gone. Perhaps to address this, a monk by the name of Umaswati in the 2nd century composes a type of Jain handbook, okay, concise text that contained all the major doctrine of Jainism. Anybody know what the name of that text is? Yeah. Tattvartha Sutra. So what's in the Tattvartha Sutra? Well, it's 10 chapters that summarize the Jain doctrine. And it's not very long. There's only about 340 aphorisms in the Tattvartha Sutra. It's pretty short compared to 6,000 in Shatkandagam. And it's accepted by both Digambara and Svetambara sects, as we showed. It makes part of their secondary canon. It's the first work in Sanskrit of Jainism. Now, you're thinking, wait a minute, why are we writing in Sanskrit now? Wasn't the whole point to write in the colloquial language, to write in Prakrit? Why are we now switching to Sanskrit? That was what we were trying to avoid in the beginning, right? Can anybody understand this? What this says? Anyone? Does anyone know what language this is? Gibberish. It's not gibberish. It may seem like gibberish. Yeah, I heard it. This is English. Would you be surprised to learn that? This is English, or at least this is what English looked like 1,000 years ago. That's right. This is before the Latin influence, before the Norman invasion of England. But this is English. Okay? Now you all speak English, right? I mean, hopefully you do because you're in an English lecture. No, before the Norman invasion. So, you all speak English, but I bet you most of you don't understand this. Right? Well, that's what happened to Prakrit. By the beginning of the Common Era, the Prakrit itself became a dead language. Okay? Prakrit used to be the colloquial language, the vernacular, but language changes over time, just like English did. It evolves. So people, the Prakrit that people were speaking during Mahavira Bhagwan's time, the Urdmagdi, well, by the beginning of the Common Era, that language was unrecognizable. Now they were speaking something else because language evolved. But the language of the scriptures remained this Prakrit, this language that now nobody could understand. They fixed it artificially, while natural spoken language evolved naturally. Okay? By the time of the beginning of the Common Era, there were few monks who could understand it, let alone lay people. So all of a sudden, it became a language of exclusivity, right? Like Sanskrit was back in the time of Mahavira Bhagwan. Sanskrit, on the other hand, had been continuously taught because it was always the language of the scholars throughout India's history. So by now, more people understood Sanskrit than did Prakrit. So he writes this text to be more accessible, not less accessible. There's a very interesting story from about the 5th century about a monk named Siddhasen Divarkar. And he had this brilliant idea to translate all the Jain agams into Sanskrit. What do you think was his reward for that great idea?
He was thrown out of the
Yeah.
order.
He was expelled from the temple for 12 years. Everything in Jainism is 12 years. I don't know why. It's like the standard famine length. So he was expelled because his elders, the leaders of the temple, wanted so badly to preserve Prakrit because it's such a special language. It's so unique. Only Jain scriptures are written in it. Well, eventually, of course, things are translated in Sanskrit and Hindi and Gujarati and even English. Tattvartha Sutra has 10 chapters, and you can see it talks about the truth, the soul. It talks about cosmology, the hells, the middle regions, heavens, gods. It's the whole section on substances, how karma attaches to you, the vows that you have to take to get rid of karma, and how you get rid of it, and then eventually how you attain liberation. So a pretty good handbook of doctrine. It is now commonly accompanied by later Svetambara and Digambara commentaries to help you understand these aphorisms. Remember, it's very short, only 300 lines, but now it's like a book because of all the commentaries. The central themes of Ahimsa, Aparigraha, Anyakantvad are very prominent in this work. Right? These are the same principles, the same central ideas that have been there throughout Jainism's history. They're still preserved. The goal of life is to liberate your soul by an enlightened worldview, enlightened knowledge, enlightened conduct. It goes on to talk about karma and bondage and this path of liberation. In addition to this, it has information about the way Jainism sees the world, sees the universe. It categorizes life forms by their senses, going down to the single sense organisms. It's very similar to microbes. And this is happening 1,500 years before the development of the microscope, before microbes are even observed. It talks about units of measurements that go from the atomic and subatomic atomic to universe-spanning measurements. Again, 1,500 years before the concept of atomic theory or the concept of light years. The universe is depicted as a Lok Purush. Does anyone know what that looks like? I'll show you. Yeah. He looks a little bit familiar to some people maybe. Wide at the bottom, a thin waist, chest at the top here. So it's called Lok Purush because it's kind of in the form of a man. Legs down here, waist, chest, arms, and a head. This is the hell region. These are the 7 hells. The worst one is down here. It's also the widest part of the universe. Incidentally, you can only get to the 7th hell if you're a man and you do something really bad. For some reason, women in Jainism theory can't do something so bad that gets them into the 7th hell, only into the 6th hell. This here, this thin part, this is the land of man. And you can see how small and insignificant this section is, and that shows you how rare it is to be born as a human and how important that opportunity is, because as a human, that's the only way you can attain moksha. And that's the only way that you can walk the path of liberation. You can't do it in any of the other regions, in any other form. And it's very small compared to the rest of the universe. It shows you how rare that opportunity is.
Drop to the scale, you can't even see the line.
Ah, there you go.
That thin.
It's like even thinner than this. Up here you have the heavens. This is where all the gods live. And at the very top, you have Siddhasila, which is where all the Siddha Bhagavans live. Now this image is depicted a lot in art, in Jain art from the 16th century onwards. And in 1975, it becomes incorporated into our universal symbol for Jainism. So, remember this book? If you're looking perhaps for a handbook, a concise, holy book that contains your doctrine, your rules, information about Jainism, then maybe this is your answer. This is Tattvartha Sutra, yeah? All right. The last thing I want to talk about before we wrap it up is the Namokar Mantra. This is probably one of the most known of the mantras in Jainism. And it is written in Prakrit, or it's said in Prakrit, 5 homages to the 5 central figures, central ascetic figures in Jainism. The Aryant Bhagwan, Siddha Bhagwan, the Acharyas, all the teachers, and the community of monks and nuns around the world. Pay respect to them. And then there's usually 4 lines after that that explain the power and significance of this mantra. Now, it is traditionally believed to be part of the original Purva. So, again, nobody wrote it. It's beginningless. But historically, does anyone know the oldest example of the Namokar Mantra that's in existence today? If you're here for last year's talk, you might remember this. Anyone? Oldest existing Namokar Mantra, right here. This is the Hathigumfa cave. Okay? And this is the inscription on that cave. This is a close-up of it. And this is the actual text. This is a script called Brahmi script. It's also the script of the edicts of Ashoka, the Great. And it says here, Namo Arihantaram, Namo Siddharam. The first 2 lines of the Namokar Mantra are found here. This was inscribed in about 167 BCE. It was commissioned by a Jain king, Karaveli of Kalinga. And it's the oldest version of the Namokar Mantra in existence today. The earliest 5-line version is the beginning of the Shatkandagam that was written down in the 2nd century, as we know, as we learned, by Pushpadant. And then for Svetambara Jains, the earliest written version appears in the Kalpa Sutra, which was first written down, as we know, in the Vallabhi Council in the 5th century. So we've seen that the scriptures in Jainism have evolved over hundreds of years. They're not the fixed, unadulterated words of our Mahavir Bhagwan or our Tirthankars. But instead they represent a vast collection of texts that include commentaries and revisions and translations and summaries and explanations that have been authored by many monks over many periods of history. And I believe that this sort of exemplifies our principle of anekantvad. Because the central truth, the central message has remained the same through all of these revisions. The core principles are the same, but the way they are conveyed to the audience has changed. It adapts to each successive generation of Jain. And so it keeps the context, it keeps the message relevant, and the way of teaching it becomes more relatable to each successive generation. And I think that is one of the most unique things about Jainism. I think one of the most wonderful aspects of our religion. Well, thank you. That is the end of the lecture. I could try to answer questions, but I don't know if I can. If anyone has any questions, I'll try. Yeah, welcome. Welcome.
Do you have the presentation available online?
I think I don't have it online, but it's a YouTube. I mean, yeah, right. It's YouTube. It's on YouTube.
It's on it. Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe you have the PowerPoints here.
Yeah, I can give you the PowerPoint.
I don't know the revision interpretation, it would have been impossible to understand the apology. So this is very helpful.